Greetings! This is the Christmas special. Conscience, the beautiful soul, evil and forgiveness. Okay, we're in the final section of spirit, and last time we spoke about what Hegel meant by conscience. So what does Hegel mean by a beautiful soul? A beautiful soul is another more advanced form of social consciousness. It's related to what Hegel called the unhappy consciousness. Hegel says, the unhappy consciousness is the gazing of one self-consciousness into another. It enters history with the Christian era of medieval Catholicism. So this form of consciousness acknowledges that it's finite and mortal, and it wants to be united with the infinite, with God. It's a religious experience. But because this unity is impossible, it's also a state of despair. It's a kind of happiness in despair. Earlier in the book, Hegel uses the example of the despair of the Crusaders, how they felt when they conquered Jerusalem, only to find the grave of Christ was empty. So this is one example of the unhappy consciousness. It's a successor form to the Stoicism of the ancient world. In part, it's the Christian ideal of the renunciation of worldly happiness. It's a desperate need to reconcile the harshness of reality with Christian, internally generated, self-absorbed contemplation. Okay, bit of a mouthful that. So this weird state of joy and despair is an historical and social phenomenon, and it lasts throughout the medieval period. But ironically, as a personal and psychological experience, it probably only lasts for a few seconds, like when you hear the beautiful jingling of bells in a church service, or the sound of a particularly lovely hymn, or when you see a beautiful icon in a church. It reminds me of when I went to Sicily and I saw the fabulous mosaics on the ceilings of Montreal Cathedral. So imagine what the faithful must have felt when they first glimpsed the interior of this building. We can still see the vivid colours because it's a mosaic and there's no paint to fade. But the experience of being taken out of yourself or lifted out of your body and transported to a transcendent state, that's only momentary. Because sure as anything, just at the moment when you think you're in touch with the divine, you start to feel hungry or thirsty, or someone starts yakking away in the background, and you're back to social reality with a bang. So medieval Sicilian peasants went home to dingy, miserable huts. So, you know, that's very, couldn't have been, when you go from the sublime to your dingy hut is a big jump. But maybe monks in religious orders, like in monasteries, they could remain in the state of ecstatic misery longer than most, because they had rituals to remind them how ecstatically miserable they were every hour of the day. So that's the unhappy consciousness. Now let's look at how the beautiful soul arises and why it's a type of unhappy consciousness. So we're going to leave behind the medieval world and fast forward to Hegel's reality when he was living in the small German town of Jena in the late 18th century. So in this town, a small intellectual elite created the Romantic movement. So this informal gathering, it was a fragile community. It included Goethe, Schelling, Fichte, the Schlegel brothers, the naturalist von Humboldt, and the very remarkable woman Caroline von Boehme. We should really do a video on her by herself. It's very interesting. Anyway, 18th century Europe was ferociously authoritarian, possibly with the exception of Britain. Germany itself was a fragmented network of statelets, Jena being one of them. It was ruled by despots or patriciates or oligarchs, all with their own bizarre, authoritarian and socially stifling rules. Fichte, he was the Jena star of philosophy. He denounced this state of affairs in his lectures in Jena. A person, he said, should be self-determined, never letting himself be defined by anything external. So, and self-determination in an autocracy is, by its very nature, a challenge to that established authority. It's one of the ironies in this section of the book that Hegel sees the beautiful soul as a retreat from the world, while at the same time, Romanticism implicitly challenged the existing order because it demanded the autonomy of the self. Despite this, the beautiful soul is the highest form of the unhappy consciousness. So why is this contradiction? Okay, the beautiful soul, like the unhappy consciousness, tries to preserve its own purity. And it does this by using its own resources to perfect this autonomous self. So it doesn't need the crutch of an official church. It looks into itself to find the answer to the gulf between the finite and the infinite. So the Reformation rejected the authority of the Pope. Luther said, don't accept the word of a priest. Catholicism means that the priest is the mediator between God and us. Catholics, therefore, need the priest to obtain salvation. And they go to confession because only the priest can give them absolution. When the power of the priest is taken away, that leads to an existential crisis. So when Martin Luther reveals that the priest is just a fellow in a frock, Catholicism is superseded by Protestantism. And that results, as I said, in this existential crisis for the unhappy consciousness. Social consciousness is looking for a way, I'm going to use this word mediate, to mediate between the finite and the infinite. Do you want to find a way to link God and man or woman without the help of a priest? The Reformation kicks away the supporting pillars of medieval Catholicism. It does away with the ritual. It does away with the paintings. It does away with the crosses. It gets rid of the priest, but it also gets rid of this emotional connection. Protestantism wrestles with this. Some Protestants go all the way and become Puritans, while others need the ritual. They're desperate for the ritual, desperate for the painting, and now we get something like Anglicanism. And let's arrive now at this Jena intellectual moment and the birth of Romanticism. And as we know, Hegel was there at the birth. Incidentally, Goethe, the Schlegels, von Humboldt, Hegel, they all grew up in very, very Protestant families. And where does this fit on a timeline? Well, the Jena intellectual movement came at the end of something called the German Sturm und Drang, Storm and Stress movement. Sturm und Drang was a very early anticipation of the German Romantic movement. It emerged in the German arts from the 1760s. And like the later Romantic movement, it was concerned with the development of a more complete notion of individual subjectivity that had been conceived by rationalist thinkers. So, what do we mean by subjectivity? So, what is this finite self and how does it relate to the infinite? In plain English, how does the individual understand themselves and their relationship with the outside world? The Romantic story is, of course, about individuality and the self, but it still is always in the context of God or the divine. The Romantic conception of the individual, it came from a different place than the subjectivity of Descartes. Descartes and the rationalists believed that the subject must overcome the power of tradition through the use of his or her own reason. Descartes challenged the idea that we do something because it's always done this way, or we think this way because people have always thought this. Rationalists saw reason as easily the most important quality possessed by humans because it allows us to know the world. And if we know the world and we're part of the world, we can also know ourselves. And remember that Descartes' evil demon analogy. Let's go back to that. So even if, he said, there's an evil demon that's able to make my senses lie to me in the way that Neo's senses lie to him in the film The Matrix. Okay, so Neo doesn't see the world as it is. It's all an optical illusion. Nevertheless, my reason's able to provide a path towards the truth. However, my senses manage to distort reality. Reason means we're able to test our knowledge and understand the world. And this is summarised in Descartes' phrase, I think, therefore I am. Giving reason the highest place in our understanding, it wasn't something new. It does go as far back as Plato and Pythagoras, more later than Pythagoras. But a systematic rationalist movement emerged only fully with Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz and Immanuel Kant. Sturm und Drang and the Romantic movement, it wanted to change the philosophical conversation. It disagreed with this idea of abstract reason being king. The writers and thinkers of this idiom believed that the way to know the world and to know the truth was through expressions of feeling and emotions. It was a response not just to the rationalism of earlier times, but other Enlightenment ideas such as French neoclassicism. Okay, so I'm making things a bit more complicated by introducing this idea of neoclassicism, but let me explain a little bit. So neoclassicism was a reaction to the Baroque style of architecture, the Baroque style of painting, Baroque music. I'll make this clear in a minute. I'll just give you the summary of each movement and why they tie into this period. So the Baroque was an art form that was encouraged by the Catholic Church as a counter to Protestantism, not on a theological level, theological, but mainly on a gut level, an emotional level. Making churches beautiful was a response to the austere Protestant churches, and it was an effort to get more punters through the door. Protestantism, radical Protestantism, and early Protestantism in particular, as you know, discourages the display of religious icons and art. So Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries during the 1530s and 40s, and the destruction of the images was nothing compared to his son Edward. In 1549, Edward decreed that the people of England should deface and destroy, or cause to be defaced and destroyed, icons, images, and the like. In 1518, Luther's immediate successor, Andreas Bodenstein von Karstadt, seems to have instituted the first wave of icon breaking in Protestant churches. Even Queen Elizabeth I, she angered many church reformers because she kept a cross in her private chapel. The interiors of many Protestant churches are a bit bleak, not all, but many are, because their focus is on the pulpit and the word of God. So what did the Catholics do in response? They went big on aesthetic complexity. They created the extravagant Baroque with its flowery, intricate designs. I mean, Otto Buren Abbey in Germany, there's so many examples. But in Italy, far away from Germany and Britain and the Protestant heartlands, the next chapter of the story unfolds. With the early excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the 1730s and 40s. And these were important cultural events, not just historical discoveries. And the discovery led to a reaction against the Baroque. The excavations led to a revival of interest into not just the ancient buildings, but the lives of the Roman citizens who lived in the buildings and who were fossilized by the volcanic eruption. Europe became fascinated once again in the subject of Roman virtues. The revival we now call neoclassicism. And neoclassicism was the way that some intellectuals responded to the perceived frivolity and extravagance of the Baroque period. So it stressed traditional Roman and Greek virtues such as sobriety and sacrifice. The structure of its art was straight lines and Roman and Greek colonnades. So a good example might be the Arc de Triomphe in France or the Pantheon in Paris. So neoclassicists marveled at Roman and Greek art. They ignored the bad bits like slavery, and they focused on Roman ideals like nobility, simplicity, honor, strength and honor. And they returned to the more geometric and less convoluted styles of architecture. And for our purposes, they wanted to return to moral values. So the Roman and Greeks were seen as paradigms of moral values. And I mean, how? I'm not sure, because they were horrible. But the Roman virtues, for example, gravitas. These words come into our language, seriousness. Okay, that's my explanation of why the Baroque and Neoclassical emerged and how they preceded this Sturm und Drang and Romanticism. The Sturm und Drang movement was part of this revolt against Neoclassicism and rationalism. And things get complicated here because this apparently contradictory movements, these overlapped. So Rousseau, for example, he's claimed by the classicists. He's claimed by the Enlightenment people. He's claimed by the anti-Enlightenment people, thinkers. Sturm und Drang, rationalism and universalism, they couldn't possibly encompass what it meant to be human. This movement, okay, so the universalism and rationalism for Sturm und Drang, they said it's just, me being a human, it just doesn't fit in with it's too cerebral, this. And they said their movement was about emphasizing experience as opposed to reason. It played upon the emotional state and the feelings of the individual. Sturm und Drang was an aesthetic movement, not a political one, and so its language was literature and music. It wanted to give its audience an emotional shock. It was a predecessor of Romanticism, but with Romanticism we go beyond artistic expressions of emotion and towards an exploration of the themes of human freedom. So if human freedom was an innate urge, and if human freedom was incomplete, then what was preventing this? And one of the uncomfortable answers was the despotism and authoritarianism of Germany. The romantic worldview was still subsumed into a religious framework. So we will get to romanticism and the beautiful soul, but let's finish with this Sturm und Drang moment. Germany, as I said, was a patchwork of mini-states, and it was ruled by absolute monarchs, or like a hereditary elite. And there was little in the way of political outlet because there was no democratic institution. The movement was an implicit critique of despotism, Sturm und Drang, but it didn't have any political language, and it didn't have the institutions to overtly critique these autocracies. Instead, it was just an aesthetic movement. And when it did look to a political solution, it looked for an enlightened despot, or some benevolent ruler to support. The arts gave them a purpose, and it gave the middle class a purpose that allowed them to transcend their narrow apolitical German experiences, but it was within very strict limits. So Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, that's a Sturm und Drang novel, and it was a sensation. The intense imaginative experiences set against the stifling confinement of traditional social structures, it captivated the European literate audience. The intensity of the feelings evoked by the book may even have led to a number of young men kill themselves in order to copy their hero. The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was published in 1774, it's an epistolary novel. So the story is told through a series of letters written by a young man called Werther to his friend. It's a story of unrequited love, and strictly speaking, romanticism, it's only tenuously connected with romantic love. Frank Tallis, who's a clinical psychologist, in his book Lovesick says, the romantic movement began in Germany towards the end of the 18th century and continued to be influential until the end of the 19th. It began as a reaction against the values and preoccupations of the Enlightenment. The great thinkers of the Enlightenment venerated reason, lived in cities, and were keen to instigate political change. Romantics, on the other hand, were fascinated by emotions, revered nature, and were far more interested in personal psychology than social reform. The concerns of the Romantic movement were much wider than those of the troubadours or the court of love of Poitiers. Even so, in all matters of love, there are several continuities with that link, with the idea of romance, the idea of romance with romanticism. Indeed, the work which launched the Romantic movement was a love story which preserves many courtly themes. This was Goethe's 1774 novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. So this epistolary novel, a story written by an exchange of letters, it was a type of novel. It went out of fashion. It returned later with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I don't think it's ever going to return because, just an aside, because with text now, no one writes letters. So new technology's killed it. But anyway, Werther's it's a sentimental novel. It celebrates emotion and sensibility. Showing your feelings was no longer a weakness, but a strength. Roman virtues were written off, strength and honor, were written off as macho bullshit. On the contrary, displays of sentiment showed you were a truly moral person, truly a man. Truth and reality, therefore, were measured in feelings, passion and emotion rather than intellect and reason. So let me quote from Rupert Christiansen's book, Romantic Affinities, Portraits from Age, 1780 to 1830. Sentimentalism was not just a literary vogue, and one strange relic gives us particular insight into the way that real people took the sensibility of Julie and Saint-Preux, who are from Rousseau's novel, Charlotte and Werther, into their own lives. So Julie and Saint-Preux are from Rousseau's book, Julie, and again, it's like a, emotion, full-on emotions. Okay, in 1777, the 17-year-old Mary Hayes, later to be well known as a champion of women's rights and a novelist, fell in love with one John Eccles, who reciprocated their feelings. Their love letters survived to chart in pages of unremitting earnestness and tedium, a copybook, sentimental passion. Being too young and penniless to marry without the consent of their parents, they were forced into secrecy and an elaborate correspondence in which they rehearsed every minute pang doubt and nuance that pass through their overheated little brains. Miss Hayes is particularly concerned with delicacy, that scrupulous self-restraint which precludes the gross and vulgar business of sexual contact. So delicate, in fact, is Miss Hayes that she addresses her love as Mr. Eccles. Christensen goes on. As Philip Larkin could write with a poet's license, that sexual intercourse began in 1963, so it could be said that romantic love, more properly, sentimental love, began in 1762 and 1774, the years in which Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse, which I referred to earlier, and Goethe's Werther were published. The new romantic love etherealized sex and made it into an affair of the soul rather than the body, a secular equivalent to the love a religious devotee feels towards the Godhead. It gloried in the pain as well as the exaltation of love. Most significantly, it believed that man and woman in love could be free and equal, equally noble, equally passionate. And with that introduction, next time we look at the pietist Protestant roots of the beautiful soul and Rousseau's ideal society. See you later.